who were born with a rare metabolic disorder, and each of them lived only 6 months.
For years, Nancy Guthrie has been known as a woman of faith, strength, and unshakable composure. Through public appearances, heartfelt messages, and deeply personal reflections, she has spoken about grief, hope, and resilience. To many, she represents steady belief in the face of unimaginable pain. But now, a new voice has entered the conversation, her daughter. And what she has finally revealed has left many stunned for decades. The public saw only one side of the story, the courageous mother navigating loss with grace. But behind closed doors, life was more complicated than anyone realized. Silence protected privacy. Silence protected family. Silence protected wounds that were still healing, until it didn't. When Nancy Guthrie's daughter chose to speak, she didn't do so lightly. Her words were careful, emotional, and deeply personal. She spoke about growing up under the weight of public grief, about what it's like when your family's pain becomes a source of inspiration for millions. She described the pressure of being strong when you're still trying to understand your own heartbreak. And that's where the story takes a turn no one expected. Because this isn't about scandal. It's about the emotional cost of living through tragedy. In front of the world. It's about the silent struggles of a child, learning to survive loss while watching her mother become a symbol of faith for others. It's about feelings that were never shared until now. And what she revealed suggests that the pain ran deeper, lasted longer, and shaped their family in ways few could imagine. This isn't just a story about breaking silence. It's a story about what that silence was protecting all along. For years, the public knew Nancy Guthrie as a woman of remarkable faith. She spoke openly about grief, loss, and the difficult work of trusting God through unimaginable pain. Her words comforted countless people who were searching for meaning in suffering. To many, Nancy became a symbol of strength, proof that faith could survive even the deepest heartbreak. But behind that public strength was a family learning how to live inside grief every single day. And at the center of that quiet struggle was her daughter. Growing up in a household shaped by loss meant growing up fast. While others saw a mother bravely standing in faith, a child was learning how to process pain without fully understanding it. Grief wasn't something that happened once. It was something that lived in the air, in conversations left unfinished, in moments where joy felt complicated. For a long time, silence felt necessary. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it felt impossible. Nancy's daughter watched her mother become a voice of hope for others while privately navigating emotions she didn't yet have words for. There was pressure to be strong, pressure to protect the family's story, pressure to honor a pain that the world already believed it understood. But grief looks different through a child's eyes. It's confusing. It's isolating, and it often feels invisible. While the public focused on Nancy's courage, her daughter was learning how to exist in a world where loss wasn't theoretical, it was personal. She learned which questions not to ask, which emotions to keep private, which moments required composure instead of honesty. Not because anyone demanded it, but because that's what silence teaches you to do. As the years passed, that silence hardened into habit. The family functioned. Life continued. Faith remained central. But unspoken feelings don't disappear. They wait. They grow heavier with time, especially when they're never given space to breathe. Nancy's daughter has now revealed that what she struggled with most wasn't just grief. It was identity. Who are you when your family's pain becomes part of a public narrative? Where do your emotions fit when everyone already believes they know the story? She lived with the constant awareness that her family's tragedy had meaning for others, that it inspired faith, that it helped people heal. And while she respected that deeply, it didn't erase her own need to grieve privately and imperfectly. There were moments when she felt she had to be careful with her honesty, careful not to sound ungrateful, careful not to disrupt the message of hope people associated with her mother, careful not to add complexity to a story the world preferred to keep simple. That emotional restraint came at a cost. She began to realize that silence, while protective, was also isolating her from her own healing. Pain unspoken became pain internalized. Questions unanswered became doubts carried alone. Still, she waited. Out of love, out of loyalty, out of respect for a mother who had already endured more than most. Breaking that silence wasn't about blame. It wasn't about rewriting history. It was about finally acknowledging that grief doesn't belong to just one person even when one voice becomes the public face of it. What her daughter has now shared doesn't diminish Nancy Guthrie's faith. It deepens the story. It reminds us that behind every narrative of strength is a family navigating pain in different ways, some visible, some hidden. And sometimes the most heartbreaking truths aren't about what happened, but about how long someone felt they had to stay quiet afterward. When Nancy Guthrie's daughter finally chose to speak, it wasn't because the pain was new. It was because carrying it silently had become heavier than the fear of being heard for years. She believed silence was the safest option, not just for herself, but for her family. Her mother, Nancy Guthrie, had become a public voice of faith shaped by loss. Countless people found comfort in her words. They saw a story of suffering redeemed by belief, grief softened by hope. Her daughter didn't want to disrupt that. She understood the impact her mother's testimony had on others. She respected it. She protected it. And in doing so, she learned to place her own emotions second, sometimes last. What she has now revealed is that growing up inside a public story of grief can feel like living in a shadow. People assumed she was okay. They assumed faith made things easier. They assumed time healed everything. But no one asked how it felt to be a child whose pain was already interpreted for her. She has shared that there were moments when she didn't feel allowed to struggle openly, not because her mother forbade it, but because the narrative around their family left little room for messy, unresolved emotions. Grief, when packaged as inspiration, can unintentionally silence the people still living inside it. She felt pressure to be grateful instead of honest. To be strong instead of confused. To represent faith instead of fear. And over time, that pressure shaped how she saw herself. Her daughter admitted that she often questioned whether her emotions were acceptable. If sadness lingered too long, she wondered if something was wrong with her. If anger surfaced, she felt guilt for having it at all. Faith was present, but it didn't erase complexity. What made it worse was the loneliness. While others spoke freely about how her family's story helped them heal, she was still learning how to grieve at her own pace. There were feelings she couldn't share publicly, and some she didn't know how to share privately. So she waited. She waited until she was older, until she had language for what she felt, until she could speak without anger, but also without minimizing her truth. Breaking her silence wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival. She revealed that what hurt most wasn't the tragedy itself, it was the expectation. That healing should look a certain way. That faith should be tidy. That grief should resolve on a timeline. Her reality was far more complicated. She spoke about moments of doubt, not in God, but in herself. Moments when she felt disconnected from the version of strength everyone expected her to embody. Moments when she wondered who she was outside of a story that wasn't fully hers to tell. And that's why her words feel so heavy now, because they expose a truth many families quietly live with. When one person becomes the public face of grief, others often disappear behind it. Her daughter has been clear. This isn't about blame. She doesn't accuse her mother. She acknowledges the love, the intention, the faith that shaped their home. But she also acknowledges the cost of silence. At times, she felt invisible in her own pain. Speaking now doesn't undo the past. It doesn't erase loss, but it gives her something she didn't have before, ownership of her own story. And that, she says, has been healing in a way silence never was. What makes this revelation worse than anyone imagined isn't scandal or conflict. It's the realization that while the world saw strength, a child was quietly learning how to survive emotions she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel. And that truth lingers long after the words are spoken. For Nancy Guthrie's daughter, the hardest part of growing up with grief wasn't the loss itself. It was learning how to carry pain without permission to put it down. As the years passed, she became skilled at appearing fine. She learned how to smile at the right moments, how to answer questions politely, how to deflect concern without inviting conversation. To the outside world, she seemed composed, resilient, even. But inside, emotions remained unresolved. layered one on top of another. She has now admitted that much of her childhood and early adulthood was shaped by emotional self-monitoring. Every feeling came with a question. Is this okay to feel? Every reaction came with hesitation. Should I say this out loud? Grief wasn't just something she experienced. It was something she managed. Watching her mother, Nancy Guthrie, speak publicly about faith and suffering created a complicated internal conflict. She admired her mother deeply. She respected the strength it took to speak so openly. But she also felt increasingly disconnected from her own emotional reality. There were days when she felt strong belief, and days when she felt nothing at all. On the days when belief felt distant, guilt crept in. She wondered if she was failing spiritually, if her inability to move forward meant she was ungrateful, if her sadness reflected a weakness she wasn't supposed to have. Those thoughts stayed with her. Over time, silence shaped how she related to others. She became cautious with vulnerability. She struggled to ask for help. Trusting that someone could hold her pain without trying to fix it felt unfamiliar. Pain, after all, had always been something to endure quietly. She has shared that friendships sometimes felt shallow, not because others lacked depth, but because she didn't know how to bring her full self into them. When people asked how she was doing, she offered safe answers. The honest ones felt too heavy to explain. Even joy felt complicated. Moments of happiness were often followed by guilt, a sense that enjoying life too freely meant forgetting what had been lost. Grief lingered beneath everything, influencing how she experienced the world. The most heartbreaking admission she made was this: she didn't realize how much pain she was carrying until she finally stopped suppressing it. When she reached adulthood, cracks began to show. Emotional exhaustion, periods of numbness, moments when the past surfaced without warning. The silence she had relied on for years no longer protected her. It isolated her. That was when she understood something crucial. Silence hadn't made her strong. It had made her alone. Breaking that pattern took time, therapy, honest conversations, learning language for emotions she had never fully expressed. It meant allowing herself to feel anger without shame, sadness without explanation, doubt without fear of disappointing anyone. She has said that healing didn't come all at once. It came in permission. Permission to grieve differently, permission to speak imperfectly, permission to exist outside of a public narrative. What changed her forever wasn't the pain itself. It was recognizing that her voice mattered, even if it complicated the story others were comfortable with. She now understands that grief is not a competition, and faith is not measured by silence. Strength can coexist with struggle. Love can exist alongside honesty. Her story doesn't contradict her mother's. It completes it. By finally sharing what she carried alone, Nancy Guthrie's daughter has given language to a truth many people live with but rarely name: that surviving loss in the shadow of public strength can be its own quiet trauma. And while the pain shaped her, it did not define her. Finding her voice did something silence never could. It gave her back to herself. When Nancy Guthrie's daughter finally shared her truth, the reaction wasn't outrage. It was recognition. People weren't shocked because there was scandal. They were shaken because her words felt real, painfully real. For the first time, the story the public thought they understood revealed another layer, a layer that had been there all along, just never spoken. For years, Nancy Guthrie had represented unwavering faith in suffering. Her testimony helped countless families navigate loss. Her composure became a model of spiritual resilience. But what her daughter revealed didn't challenge that strength. It expanded it. Suddenly, people began to understand that grief inside a family does not move in one direction. It does not resolve neatly just because one person finds clarity. Pain spreads differently through each heart it touches. Her daughter's honesty forced a new question: what happens to the people standing beside the public voice of hope? In speaking out, she didn't accuse her mother of wrongdoing. She didn't dismantle the legacy of faith their family had built. Instead, she exposed something far more universal: the complexity of private emotions living under public narratives. Many listeners, especially adult children of visible leaders, quietly related. They understood what it meant to protect a parent's mission while suppressing personal struggle. They recognized the pressure to maintain unity, to avoid adding weight to an already heavy story. Her words resonated because they weren't dramatic. They were human. She described the exhaustion of feeling responsible for how her emotions might be perceived, the quiet loneliness of wanting space to grieve differently, the internal conflict between honoring her family's faith and acknowledging her own doubts. And in doing so, she gave permission to others, permission to admit that grief doesn't always look inspirational. Permission to say that faith can coexist with confusion, permission to speak without fear of ruining a carefully held image. That's why her silence breaking felt worse than anyone imagined. Not because something terrible had been hidden, but because something deeply human had been. The world often prefers stories of clean redemption, of pain transformed quickly into purpose, of suffering that fits neatly into a lesson. But her daughter reminded everyone that healing is rarely tidy. It's uneven. It's slow. It's personal. What changed most after her words weren't the facts of the past, it was perspective. People began to see that strength can unintentionally cast shadows, that even the most loving families can struggle with unspoken expectations, that silence, though protective, can create distance over time. Her decision to speak wasn't about rewriting history. It was about reclaiming space within it. And perhaps most powerfully, it showed that honesty doesn't weaken a family's story, it deepens it. Nancy's legacy of faith remains intact, but now it stands alongside another truth, that grief inside a family is layered, and every voice within it deserves to be heard. In the end, this wasn't a revelation of betrayal. It was a revelation of complexity. And sometimes, understanding that complexity is more heartbreaking and more healing than any scandal ever could.